Our next speaker is Andrew D. Basiago. Andrew is a lawyer and a writer from the state of Washington who is emerging as a major figure in the truth movement. He has been identified as a planetary-level whistleblower by the WebBot, which analyzes the content of the World Wide Web to discern future trends. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Andy was a child participant in Project Pegasus, the United States time-space exploration program at the time of its emergence. Today, he is leading a truth campaign to lobby the United States government to declassify its time travel secrets so that teleportation can be used throughout the world to the advantage of humanity in the 21st century. In his talk today, Project Pegasus and the Triumph of the Human Spirit, Andy will provide a rare glimpse into the efforts that were made while he was serving on Project Pegasus to make him forget his time travel experiences. He will also tell how he overcome such oppression so that today one human being empowered by the dream of bringing teleportation to the world is ending the U.S. government's time travel cover-up. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my high honor and distinct privilege to give you Andrew D. Basiago.
My friends, I'm happy to report that Project Pegasus, my campaign to reveal the truth about the U.S. government's time travel cover-up so that teleportation can be used to advantage humanity in the 21st century, is 40 years old today. For it was on April 9th of 1971, as a young child involved in DARPA's Project Pegasus, that I performed my first revolutionary act to end the time travel cover-up. It is my privilege to accept Michael Austin Melton's invitation to speak at the Free Your Mind conference here today and describe how and why my truth campaign about time travel began, and do so in the city where liberty was born. 40 years ago, I found myself at the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, which was a sprawling aerospace assembly facility of that time. And in Building 68, there was a teleporter based on Tesla technology that we were using to reach the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, New Mexico in several seconds. The teleporter consisted basically of two elliptical-shaped objects on the floor of one of the rooms there in Building 68. When the device was turned on, it broadcast a shimmering curtain of radiant energy, and that Nikola Tesla had both discovered. It's an energy that is latent and pervasive in our universe, suggesting that literally the physical substrates of the time-space continuum are permeable, and that now that Tesla, even going back 100 years ago, developed a way to tap this energy, that gives humanity essentially unlimited access to the time-space continuum, the capacity not just to travel in space and understand what's going on in space when we're there, but literally the opportunity to travel in time-space and visit any part of the universe at any time. And so we would leap through this curtain of radiant energy, and a vortal tunnel would open up. It resembled the tunnel that people report in the near-death experience, but I think it's fair to say that it was more turbulent. If we looked to our right or left, we could see holographic images of intervening events in the time-space continuum going on. And we would be in that tunnel for several seconds. We would then suddenly see a little point of light in the distance, and that light would close on us very quickly, and we would then be relocated in the time-space continuum where the tunnel closed. The location at which they were usually closing the tunnel and teleporting us somewhere was the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I once asked my father, Raymond Basiago, who was a special projects engineer employed by the Ralph M. Parsons Company, why we were going to Santa Fe via teleportation, if so often we would then drive to the Los Alamos National Labs in Los Alamos, New Mexico, or the Sandia National Labs adjacent to the Kirtland Air Force Base outside of Albuquerque. And he said because somebody at the labs, namely the Los Alamos Labs, might see something. And so think of the Cold War context of this. We had not only developed operational time travel, namely teleportation, by 1970, but we were literally hiding it from the Soviet spies that were believed to be at the Los Alamos National Labs. And so on this particular day, April 9th, 1971, literally 40 years ago today, I had decided, for a number of reasons that I'll describe today, to essentially begin sabotaging the project. That is, sabotaging the secrecy regime that existed, that surrounded the project and prevented the advent of time travel from being understood by humanity at large. At Curtiss-Wright, I took that morning that we were planning to, again, teleport to Santa Fe, as we had probably about 20 or 30 times at that point. I took out a small pad of paper and I wrote, "I teleported here from Curtiss-Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey on April 9th, 1971, and then I signed my name. Then, a few minutes later, we jumped through the device. I found myself popping into view in the state capitol grounds there, thankfully uninjured. And I ran into the Bataan Memorial Building. The Bataan Memorial Building, if you ever have the delight of going to Santa Fe, I would urge you to visit the state capitol complex. There's a very beautiful post-1966 state capitol, the rotunda there, the roundhouse. But the Bataan Memorial Building was the pre-1966 state capitol building. It has a distinctive bell tower atop it, which was our visual landmark or hallmark whenever we teleported to Santa Fe, that we would use to get to the collection area, which was the plaza in front of the Bataan Memorial Building. I ran into the building to a location on the second or third floor where, on a previous teleporting to Santa Fe, I had noticed that there was a public telephone listing out of the wall in a kind of a brass box, or basically the metallic housing of the telephone in the wall there inside one of the hallways of the Bataan Memorial Building. And the public had been throwing, I guess, their old phone numbers and fortunes or whatever else. A kind of a public wishing well had formed. I could see little scraps of paper back there. And so I threw my note in there, hoping that someday it would be discovered and that I would achieve a little bit of a victory in terms of overcoming the secrecy on the project. I was 9 years old. Just to give you some historical perspective, 2 weeks later, a 26-year-old Navy lieutenant named John F. Kerry would give his historic testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee describing atrocities committed by U.S. forces in Vietnam. And I kind of think that in a related way, I was doing my part to make America's military policies consistent with our highest ideals as a nation, because in this particular lecture, I'd like to focus on the things that were done to deprive us of our civil liberties at the very time that we were serving the United States government in the emergence of time travel as small children. Now, what was Project Pegasus, and why at age 9 had I already begun my campaign to reveal publicly the time travel cover-up, which I've now been involved in earnest for about a decade at midlife? Project Pegasus was the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence. I like to think of it as the real Philadelphia experiment, the secret U.S. government project for which various disinformational ploys have been crafted, and we've all seen them in feature films and on television and in books and so forth, giving the American people and the people of the world a false view of the time travel devices that have actually been developed. Its function, that is to say, its purpose as a classified defense-related research and development program, was not to necessarily develop time travel technologies. In fact, they were cobbling together a variety of existing time travel technologies to create an intelligence gathering program. The mission of DARPA's Project Pegasus, as it was explained to me in a mimeographed copy of a Defense Department occasional paper, was to provide remote sensing in time to the U.S. government. It was hoped that if a fully fledged time travel program could emerge, then better information about past and future events would be passed along to the President, the intelligence community, and the military for those executive branch officials to engage in better current planning, that is to say contingency planning, for future events. And while serving on Project Pegasus, I became aware of the number of events, basically the events, some of the major events of our time, that were known by the U.S. government in the early 70s. Now, what is DARPA? DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is the U.S. defense agency that we're always told, ad infinitum, gave us the internet. Also involved were the United States Navy, which trained us and also debriefed us when we would travel in time. We would be questioned by a lieutenant commander for the Office of Naval Intelligence. The U.S. Army was involved securing the bases. One of the major individuals who assisted me in my investigation was Captain Ernest Garcia, who literally was the person for protecting us when we were on the project and securing the project locations. And the CIA. The CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. So the information about past and future events that was being gained via time travel was being passed along to the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, individuals on the project, like my late father, like Dr. Harold M. Agnew of the Los Alamos Labs, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense attaché to the project, were reading those intelligence reports, and there were often discussions about future events taking place. What we're never told about DARPA, however, is that by 1970, it had achieved quantum access to past and future events. Now, why do I use the phrase quantum access? Well, time travel implies physical travel, but in fact, quantum access is an umbrella term that includes physical time travel, such as is provided by Tesla teleporters, psychic time travel, which involves remote viewing, which has been the emphasis of a lot of the disclosures that thus far have taken place in this area, and different forms of paraphysical time travel when holograms are propagated that reveal something taking place non-locally. Let me describe what these time travel technologies were. I mean, if we're to free our minds from the enthrallment of time travel mythology and have the opportunity to use time travel in the 21st century to benefit humanity, which is what was Tesla's dream, it's what should originally have occurred, we have to understand what the time travel capability that the U.S. government developed in the early 1970s was and is, so we know exactly what we're talking about and we can make intelligent decisions about how to empower society with the opportunities provided by these technologies and protect them from some of the inherent dangers that they present. Remember, one of the principal truths of the truth movement is that what falls between what the public has been told about what the U.S. government has achieved and the state-of-the-art reality of what it's achieved falls everything that's covered under the umbrella of official state secrecy. So there's a lot of discussion about what goes on in secret, but not a lot of informed discussion, and that's what I'm going to try to provide in the next part of my talk, which is to briefly describe, without going into too much anecdote, because I only have 55 minutes here, the 7 forms of time travel that were fully operational by 1970, and which I can speak about because I was directly and personally involved in their operation. The first was remote viewing, sometimes called technical remote viewing, as articulated by Ed Dames. But pure remote viewing doesn't involve any technology, does it? So let's just call it remote viewing. Remote viewing has been used in what I call the high-sci cover-up. It's a disinformational ploy in which many remote viewers have come forward describing how there has been a psi warfare and a psi intelligence gathering capability since the early 70s, but never revealing that a lot of the people, at least some of the people involved in the remote viewing program, were involved in its related activities, including physical time travel to gather information at a distance. I wasn't involved in a lot of remote viewing. I think maybe 3 or 4 probes via pure or conventional remote viewing. One of the things we did, and this was in the fall of 1969, right around the time that I entered Project Pegasus, 3 years before the official timeline of remote viewing beginning in 1972 at the Stanford Research Institute. 3 years before that often touted date in the history of remote viewing, a lieutenant commander came to the learning lab where we were being trained for time travel, and he showed us a very large photograph of a naval aviator who had been who had crashed and been taken as a POW in Vietnam. He didn't give his name, but he showed us this large blow-up of his Annapolis graduation photograph. And he explained to us that John, the young man depicted in his naval uniform in the photograph, was being kept by bad people, as they put it, somewhere else in the world. We were then shown a simple line drawing of what must have been the Hanoi Hilton, because the naval aviator we were looking for was Lieutenant John McCain, who just ran for president in 2008. In 1969, his father was the commander of the Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy, and hence he was a high-priority target for extraction by our forces, or even a high-priority target to be bombed so that he couldn't be exploited in propaganda purposes as the son of the commander of the Pacific Fleet. And they said, children, we know some of you are very psychic. You will sometimes tell your parents about a news event that happens a week, a month, a year later. Between today and next week, next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, when we return to your school here, we want you to allow your mind to go and look for where John is being kept by bad people in the world. And I remember during my lucid dreaming over the next week, seeing images of this young man from the photograph being frog marched through hallways, being suspended by his elbows in a barren room. And I saw how his captors had dug an earthen hallway under the superstructure, under the pediment that the building was constructed on. And I saw him being sort of shoved into a prison cell constructed in the wall of this earthen hallway with a single light bulb illuminating his location. And I could see that he couldn't stand up. It was about maybe 4 feet high, what we would call a tiger cage in the literature of the Vietnam conflict. And as I began to tell the lieutenant commander from the U.S. Navy what I saw, one of my colleagues, a little girl from one of the other local elementary schools, popped up and began describing the same thing. So we were very bright children. I mean, as a young toddler even, when I learned how to talk, I would sometimes go into the carpentry shop that my dad kept in our cellar in our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, and complete his thoughts. I remember one time I went down there and I said, Dad, Mom doesn't just view you as a meal ticket, she loves you. So my dad was fulminating about some argument he'd had with my mom. I know he didn't believe that on the level of his heart, but so I would pick up what he was thinking, what he was ruminating about. Another thing that happened in this area of special kids is I'd been watching my 2 older brothers constructing something with their Tinker toys about 3 feet off the floor of our rec room in New Jersey. And I thought, why on this planet, in this life, do you have to follow this law of gravity thing and build something from the ground up? Why can't you just suspend it like I was shown in one of my last lives? And they knocked their skyscraper they had built on the floor of the rec room down, ran outside, and I began picking up their toys and my alphabet blocks. I certainly hadn't entered kindergarten yet in fall of 1966 as a 4-year-old, so I may have very well been 2.5, 3 years old. And I had a flashback to a life as a gray extraterrestrial type, where somebody was showing me how to levitate things or cause them to be suspended in space with your mind. And I took the objects and with 100% intent, people talk about the law of intent, the law of manifestation, utterly believing that the object should stay hovering 3 feet off the ground, they did. I just started placing the toys 3 feet above the ground, and my dad, who then held, for about 15 years, had held a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh University, which is one of the leading engineering programs in the country, where about half of what he did was in physics and mathematics, hence his involvement in Pegasus, was astonished to see his number 3 son and 5th child levitating his toys about 3 feet off the ground of the rec room. So I mentioned that just in passing to indicate that, as John F. Kennedy said, the human mind is the ultimate resource. And we should be focusing on expanding the capacities of the human mind, because ultimately our mind itself gives us access to the time-space continuum and will allow us, and has already allowed us, to do remarkable things in it. Now, at that time, my dad had been working in the aerospace community for about 10 years. Among one of the projects that he was on was the original ramjet project at Curtiss Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, which was a high-speed jet aircraft program begun in October of 1952 in response to the July 1952 overflight of our nation's capital by 9 extraterrestrial craft clocked at 7,000 miles per hour by the Langley Air Force Base. So my dad was steeped in that culture of secret aerospace projects, and I have to believe that he may have notified the government about my special abilities. You know, hey, my youngest son is levitating things. Maybe we can use him in a project. But at some point before the end of my kindergarten year, this would have been summer of '67, my dad had been approached to involve me in Project Pegasus because he began taking me to project locations in New Jersey. So when the project was fully fledged in fall of 1969, which for me was the beginning of the 3rd grade year, they initially began training us to accurately see and report things back when we were time traveling. They were also honing our psychic ability by involving us in military, actually Navy remote viewing programs, or probes. Another thing they began in that first year in the learning lab was they were involving us in an ancient occult practice which involves placing an individual, could be an adult as well as a child, spread eagle on the back of a tabletop-like device and spinning us at 33 rotations per minute clockwise, which if you learn to relax your mind and look up at a spiral image on the ceiling, you can literally induce an out-of-body experience. And they taught us how to do that. I remember one time when I had gone out of body after they were spinning me, I reached a kind of a physical limit to the non-ordinary realm that I was accessing via spinning. And I asked one of the ladies from DARPA what it was, and she says, yes, many other people have reported that. We think it's the physical limit, it's the infrastructure of the device that is generating the hologram that we find ourselves in. We're calling it the Matrix. And this, of course, was 10 years before the Wachowski brothers produced the feature film by that title. The Matrix apparently was the machine that generates the synthetic reality that we inhabit. So from that we can derive the conclusion that by 1970 the U.S. government had concluded, but I mean, that in a sense, while we're living in a created reality, it's a synthetically created one. As William Shakespeare said, all the world is a stage. During that first year, in the spring of 1970, so this is the second half of my 3rd grade year, I took part in something that's been confirmed by the great Dr. David Lewis Anderson, which is that the Montauk Chair went national in spring of 1970, and thousands of American school children were involved in probes to the future in the Montauk Chair. The Montauk Chair exists, and in fact, when I've been asked to comment about Project Montauk, which came later, I can confirm that the research director for Project Montauk, Jack Pruitt, also exists. Jack was one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus. I think what Montauk probably was a spin-off of Pegasus, because 15 years before the early 1980s, when the Montauk timeline begins, we were doing more advanced things with an array of time travel technologies to include the Montauk Chair. I believe that, and I'm often asked, do you think these technologies were reverse engineered from extraterrestrial craft? And I say no. Most of them were of human invention, except for the Montauk Chair, because if you're traveling at a great rate of speed, either in a linear sense through through space, via propulsion, or you're traveling in a non-linear way in time-space via teleportation. The extraterrestrials reach you on your cell phone while you're lecturing. You have to know where your craft is going or you're going to crash, right? So I believe the Montauk Chair emerged in the extraterrestrial context where the pilot of the ships sits there in this apparatus and thinks where the ship should go, where the time ship should go, not the spaceship. And let me describe the Montauk Chair. It's basically a comfortable, recumbent chair like you would encounter in a dental office. There's an umbrella above your head, like a photographer's umbrella. There's a solenoid, a big circular electromagnetic device on the back of the chair. and then there's some sort of cathode ray tube that comes up and it's directed at your face. We would have an earphone headset and diodes placed over our eyes, and when the probe to the future began, we would hear this set of syncopated sound tones. It was very sort of musical and kind of like a PBX or a fax squall, but a little bit sort of prettier than that. And we would have this apparently random flashing of different colored lights directed at our eyes from behind a cotton mask that was placed over our eyes. And after about 30 seconds of hearing that sound and of seeing the flashing lights, we would go out of body and we would find ourselves moving rapidly forward, and we'd see something on the horizon, and then we would collide with it and find ourselves in a moment of our own subjective future. So the Montauk chair basically is a magnetic transducer that enables somebody to visit a subjective moment of their actual future, not seeing themselves live it, but as they live it. Like, I'm living this now. I'm not seeing myself give this talk. I'm giving it. And so when we would visit the future via the Montauk chair, we would be there in our shoes in real time. I remember one time I went forward in time, and I was in my house with my wife, and she said, "What's wrong, honey? You seem kind of peaked." And I said, "I don't know. I think maybe I'm falling ill." And she said, "Well, why don't you just sit down and lay down and take a rest here on the couch?" And I did, and then I woke up in the Montauk chair as a 9-year-old in Morris Plains, New Jersey. I remember another time I was walking back to the learning lab from the room where the Montauk chairs were located. There's not just one chair, it's just a device. There were multiple chairs. And I was walking along with one of my peers in the program who went on to become an MD, PhD at the University of Virginia, David. And he said, and I always think of those cartoons by William Hamilton in the New Yorker. He said, we were walking along down the hallway, and he said, "So who were you this time?" And I said, "I was a lawyer in Seattle." So at that time, I had no family members or even neighbors who were attorneys. My Uncle Ed was living in Santa Barbara, California. I had been past Philadelphia unconventionally via teleportation, but I had never traveled conventionally beyond Philadelphia. In fact, this is my second day here ever visiting Philadelphia. And so yet, as a New Jersey school child, I saw myself practicing law in Washington State, which I've now been doing since 1996. So clearly the future I visited on that particular probe was my actual future, or some very close semblance of it. The fourth type of time travel that was developed by DARPA by 1970, in fact, it existed for many years before that, for decades before that, is the chronovisor. The devices that Dan Burrish in his Project Camelot testimony refers to as looking glass technology. The derivation of the chronovisors was not extraterrestrial. It was an accidental discovery made by two Vatican priests named Pellegrino Ernetti and his colleague Pierre Maria Gemelli. In the 1940s at the Catholic University of Milan, let me just mention the Catholic connection because Roman Catholicism came up at this conference. The faction of the CIA that was developing this time travel capability for the US government had not only been instructed by the Vatican to develop these time travel technologies, but it was the Catholic faction within CIA. My father and many of the other project principals were devout Roman Catholics. I think you could even say some of them were sort of knights of the Catholic Church. So I have to be true to the historical record and say that Project Pegasus was a Catholic project inside of DARPA. But Ernetti and Gemelli were studying Gregorian chants to try to determine how they have special properties, like healing properties. And they were working on a specialized microphone to split the signal of the voices in the chants. And to their astonishment, something that Gemelli's father had said to him in childhood came through the microphone. And then working with the distinguished Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, by 1952 they had a device that would render a two-dimensional image of a past event, including, Ernetti would claim, up to the time of his death in 1994, moving images of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I can verify that such images have been retrieved by the U.S. government, because in 1972 at the Sandia National Labs, I was invited to view about a 20-minute black and white documentary film that depicted the crucifixion, and it was very close to the account in the New Testament, or accounts in the New Testament of Jesus' death. They later, sometime between 1952, when they still had this two-dimensional flat screen technology like a television set, and the early 70s, apparently with the involvement of Bell Labs of Murray Hill, New Jersey, which was about 15 minutes from our house, they had found a way to drive an electromagnetic signal through an octagonal or 8-sided array of bismuth crystals. And when they did that, the stage, just like this stage here, would basically light up with a cubical rendering, like a cubical form of cinema, of a past, or initially a past, and then later they found a way to get a future event. So there was a blue line on the floor where the front of that cube was. So if you were standing, let's say, where Alfred Weber is, Alfred would see the event that was going on inside this cube. But if you were standing where I am here when the device was turned on, you experienced being in that past or future place. Was it just a virtual reality? No. Was it physical time travel? No. I speak of it as a physio-virtual form of time travel because you were physically there, but you were also back at the lab where the hologram was generated. There was a kind of a quality of quantum paradox involved. But this device was a very powerful time travel device because one of the limitations of travel to the past, as some of the contemporary time travel theorists like Dr. Ronald Mallet or Dr. Michio Kaku have pointed out, theoretically it's impossible to visit the past before the existence of your technology because you'll be stranded there. There won't be a device to get you back to the present. Well, that's not true with chronovision because, after all, it's just a hologram of a past event. And I mean, on my second probe in the chronovisor at Morristown, New Jersey, I visited a prehistoric time in Arizona where I walked along a path for about 10 minutes and I could see several large dinosaurs chomping on tall grass. So chronovision gave the U.S. government access to the distant past by 1970. I mentioned the Tesla teleporter that we were using to get to Santa Fe and then at Curtiss Wright, and then we would jump back to Curtiss Wright from the Sandia National Labs. The teleporter, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Nikola Tesla, and I might say our immigration policies, because he was probably our greatest immigrant American genius. And Tesla had been working on teleportation from 1899 during his famous stay in Colorado Springs, Colorado. There are really three Nikola Teslas. There's the Tesla of conventional electrical engineering, who finds his role there in the in the textbooks of engineering, along with Steinmetz and Ohms and Watt and other great electrical engineers. There's the Tesla of the free energy cover-up of the 1970s, where there's an emphasis on the fact that he found a way to generate limitless free energy. And then there's what I call the third Tesla, which is the historically valid Tesla, which is the Nikola Tesla that gave us teleportation. Now, was it the teleportation that we see in Star Trek, where you stand, as one of the little girls in the project said, are we going to stand on this platform and be turned into 1,000 bees of light, like on Star Trek? And Jack Pruitt explained, no, and he asked, and I said, well, that would kill somebody, right? And he said, yeah. It did the opposite. Tesla teleportation doesn't dematerialize and then rematerialize the teleportee, as the quantum teleportation of our current science reporting suggests is under development as a disinformational ploy. It opens up a vortal tunnel in time-space, and you pass through to another location. There were two other forms of time travel that I had pretty minimal contact with that also allowed for physical time travel. The first was a Stargate device that was basically an advanced teleportation unit that was at the Cerrillos Cultural Center in Cerrillos, New Mexico. And we were using that for one purpose, which was to jump forward in time. We would pop into view on this plaza, this sprawling industrial park, and we would go into a building and be given these microfilm summaries of events occurring between the early 1970s and 2045. And so the reason I'd like to call my talk today, well, actually I gave it a different title today, Project Pegasus and the Triumph of the Human Spirit, but I often call my talks a brief history of the future, because that in fact is what Project Pegasus gave the United States government. I personally was involved in going forward, getting these scrolls, taking them back. We would pop into view not at the Cerritos Cultural Center again, but in the grounds surrounding the radio antenna array at the Lobo Overlook site north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, and due west of the Continental Divide sign. If you're familiar with Colorado, you go up 160 from Pagosa Springs, you reach the Continental Divide sign, and then you take this serpentine road about 3 miles off trail, and I call it Montauk Southwest. There's this huge radio antenna array there, and that's where we were popping into view from the distant future, because these sophisticated towers that you see around the country, some of them are being used to ping a microwave emission into time-space so that program participants in the future can bring our teleportees back to the precise location in their present from which they came. I remember going up there with my dad when it was about the size of a small ranger station with a few rudimentary antennas, microwave antennas. But during my fact-finding trips to New Mexico in 2003, 4, and 8, I drove up there just to reminisce, and it's a huge facility now with about 100 sophisticated antennae. So don't just believe that they're sending your cell phone transmissions around the world in real time. A lot of this communications infrastructure, at least some of it, is actually still being used in the time-space program. If you can't ping a signal, if you don't send a microwave burst into time-space, there's no way for project scientists in the future, or technicians, to know where they should send somebody back to their past, actually to their present in the past. And then another device that allowed for physical time travel I was only involved in once, and that was a plasma confinement chamber operated by Dr. Sterling Colgate of New Mexico Tech Institute of Science and Technology at a small lab in East Hanover, New Jersey. Now, I'd just like to kind of provide a little bit about the plasma confinement chamber and how the facts of my investigation have linked up. And by the way, from that device, I was sent for the purpose to November 19th of 1863 for the purpose of witnessing Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. And as it turned out, because of a number of things that happened there, I didn't see Lincoln at Gettysburg on that particular trip, but I ended up being photographed there in what was, until recently, the only known photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg. Also happens to be the first known photograph of a time traveler from the future. Now, before I investigated something like the plasma confinement chamber and Dr. Colgate, I remembered that Dr. Sterling Colgate was the director of that particular part of the program with that device. I remembered that my father had explained that he was a scion of the Colgate-Palmolive fortune, which was funding Project Pegasus on a sort of a corporate cutout basis. That is to say, funded privately, even though it was a Vatican project being undertaken by the U.S. Navy and Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So Colgate, plasma confinement, what he looked like, the fact that he was a very taciturn scientist, usually holding his hands inside of his white lab coat, and that I remembered that I had been photographed at Gettysburg because I had brought the news magazine where I found the photograph to my dad and said, look, when you sent me to Gettysburg, they got a picture of me. And he looked at it and said, yep, just don't talk about it. So during my second fact-finding trip to New Mexico in 2004, I had called Aerojet Corporation facility and asked them about the C-shaped building that then existed on the periphery of New Mexico Tech. I had described to friends the sign, the marble sign that bore the words Aerojet Corporation, that I had had encounters with Dr. Colgate in that campus, both New Mexico Tech and the existing, or the other building, which was this C-shaped building being operated by Aerojet Corporation. And when I went there, my friend Dixie Karras and I drove up to where I thought the C-shaped building had been. There's another data point. And to our luck, the research director for New Mexico Tech was sitting on a retaining wall eating her lunch. Her name was Joy Thompson. And she was dying from a cancer that she contracted as an individual who had grown up in New Mexico. New Mexico is highly irradiated as a result of strontium-90 contaminated the landscape from all the nuclear fission that has occurred there. And I said, in the early 1970s, wasn't there a C-shaped building here? And wasn't it operated by Aerojet Corporation facility? And didn't it have the zero-scaped courtyard in the middle? And wasn't there a macadam blacktop here on the lawn that accommodated about 8 vehicles? And she said, your friend practically drove her SUV on it. It was right here. And where the building had been, there's now this sinkhole. So there was clearly some high-energy physics going on there. We then entered the research library of New Mexico Tech, and these various people working for Joy, who had either grown up in Socorro or in other cities in New Mexico, which is a very small state in terms of population, confirmed that yes, there was an Aerojet Corporation facility there in the early 70s. I had spoken with Aerojet, and they said that they didn't have a presence in Socorro until 1985. Well, they were lying, because local residents confirmed the existence of the building that I remembered. We then went into the research library where there was the clip file for New Mexico Tech, and she pulled the Dr. Sterling Colgate file because he had been the director, or what do you call it, the chair of the physics department when I was there, and my father and I had contact with him. By the way, at that building, that Aerojet Corporation facility, one day we had been called down to view about a 20-second film loop of one of the planes hitting the Twin Towers 30 years in the future during 9/11. But nonetheless, I remembered this man, Dr. Sterling Colgate, the connection to New Mexico Tech, the building. So we go into the research library there, into the clip file, and it was a clipping from 1972, the very spring of 1972, the very time frame where I had remembered that Dr. Colgate had sent me to Gettysburg in 1863 from the Time Lab in East Hanover, New Jersey in 1972. And I have a copy of this in my research file. It says, Dr. Sterling Colgate, at that point I think he was president of New Mexico Tech, will be lecturing tonight about his work in plasma confinement. So I share that anecdote to indicate that, look, I couldn't make that up. I mean, maybe Ray Bradbury or the Wachowski brothers could, but I'm not a creative writer. Second, if something besides direct involvement in time travel allowed me to link all of those facts in my mind before doing direct field investigation to verify those facts as being related, Dr. Colgate, plasma confinement, New Mexico Tech, Aerojet Corporation facility, early 1970s, what was that causation? Could it have been psychic performance? Well, if it was, then I'm the most talented psychic of all time. I don't think so. Could it have been alien contact? I did have some alien contact experiences in early childhood. Well, if it was downloaded by aliens, how did they retrieve the information? Were they monitoring Dr. Colgate's work at New Mexico Tech? I mean, the specificity of those facts and their interlinkage is mind-blowing. So that was the nature of my investigation beginning in earnest around 2002. I've now gathered hundreds of facts proving that Project Pegasus existed, that it involved the development and application of, for the most part, application of several time travel technologies, and that I was in the program. In fact, Dr. Jean Maria Arrigo, an ethicist that works closely with the US military and intel community, confirmed by around 2003 that I should stop second-guessing my memories because I was, as she put it, in all that quantum physics stuff that was being done in the early 70s. So for me, I think that the proof regarding Sterling Colgate is almost the proof of the whole case I've been trying to make. I mean, if I didn't gather those facts in my mind from direct personal experience, I mean, anything that happens to us can be the result of something else, right? Mistake, delusion, mind control, a download from some other cosmic source. But if one of those sources was involved, then how was I able to put all that together 35 years later when I first retrieved the memories of Dr. Colgate and New Mexico Tech? So some of or at least that time travel technology, I don't have any understanding of how it worked. We were basically entering plasma that had been held under confinement and wormholing to a past event. And I've described how when I walked into Gettysburg, I was barefoot because my shoes had been wrenched off in the violent wormholing that I experienced when I walked into the plasma, and that I was given a set of grossly oversized men's street shoes by a Gettysburg cobbler. So if I was delusional, or this was the result of some other cause, how could I describe being given these grossly oversized shoes and then finding the picture of me, the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg, which was uncovered in 1951, 10 years before my birth? I mean, how could I end up remembering that the photo existed and then find the photo that shows me in the grossly oversized shoes that the cobbler gave me? So I have a lot of internal proofs like that that now number in the hundreds. And so I'm completely clear now that Project Pegasus existed and that these technologies have been around for 40 years. Now, I first teleported to Santa Fe with my dad in 1967-68 for a meeting with Dr. Harold Agnew at the Los Alamos Labs, at which my dad would present a prospectus to Dr. Agnew, who was then the director of the weapons division, the W division at the lab. That's one of the reasons I'm speaking out. If we're going to talk about freeing our mind, we have to free our minds, our human potential, by recognizing that in the area of time travel was weaponized in 1943 when two War Department officers seized Nikola Tesla's papers shortly after his death and forwarded them to the physicists that were then gathering in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the atomic bomb. That's where time travel remains. Time travel has been made secret and sequestered within that which Laura's distinguished great-grandfather, President Eisenhower, called the military-industrial complex. I like to refer to it as the military-industrial intelligence corporate congressional media complex. So we have to liberate time travel from the military. Not necessarily because it's been abused by the U.S. military. I don't think it's been used very much by them in warfare. It certainly continues to be used for intelligence gathering, but because we're going to need Tesla teleportation to achieve sustainability in the 21st century. So this is one area in terms of freeing our mind and freeing our society where we're going to have to demand that the U.S. government come clean on time travel because we're going to be needing teleportation. I mean, every time they build another freeway in California, the right lane fills up with cars. We're running out of space. We're immersed in what seems to be an incipient World War III scenario as a result of our reliance on Middle Eastern oil, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're going to go from 7 billion human beings to 9 billion, at least, by 2045, we're going to have to apply teleportation to achieve what Ivan Browning spoke publicly about in 1971, which is quote-unquote finding a way. See, this is how the intelligence community hides things in plain sight. After teleportation was already operational within the defense technical community, Dr. Ivan Browning, who was the director of science and technology for CIA, in a print interview, said, we have to start thinking of finding ways to not have somebody travel from point A to point B, but to have them stop being at point A and start being at point B. Well, that's Tesla teleportation. It had already been developed at that point. But I think that's a truism. And if we're going to survive as a planetary civilization, we're going to be needing these time travel technologies. So undoubtedly, when I look back on my project experiences, most of which were really amazing, I was definitely a lucky individual, not only to be one of the 140 American school children who were attached to Project Pegasus, but to be one of the several children who went on to do the most advanced things in the project. And namely, for example, the trips to 2045 to retrieve the data scrolls were among the most far out things that we did. They were the greatest application of time travel in a real-time probe to the past or future. I mean, definitely I was cosmically privileged in the sense that I was the first American child to teleport. I took part in journeys to past and future events that were at times awe-inspiring and at times terrifying. In the 5th grade, when I started to develop some emotional resistance just to being involved in a defense project like this, my dad sat me down in my bedroom and said, Andy, you're being given the opportunity to see things and do things that some people may never have an opportunity to see and to do, even in their whole lives. And he was actually starting to cry because he felt that we were privileged to be involved in something that he viewed as he said to me right before his death in 1990, something that was great. We were being given a range of human experience that was being held back from others. I also remember when it would be explained to me, not with a huge keenness, but I had some sense of pride of being involved in my nation's defense efforts during its hour of maximum danger. There were really two Cold War threats that the U.S. government was worried about. One was, I call them the Greys and the Reds. We were beginning to be visited in earnest by extraterrestrials and interdimensionals, beginning at least in earnest in the 1940s, after we began blowing up nuclear weapons. And they were also concerned about the former Soviet Union, the Reds. Their leading concern about a defense threat to the continental United States was a Soviet land invasion on Soviet naval vessels of the United States mainland. So I had a sense of that from my dad and how serious what we were involved in. One time at Curtiss Wright, he said, "Andy, see that guard tower there?" I said, "Yes, Dad." "I want you to look at the guard and then start running that way." I said, "Okay." And then he said, "Okay, son, you run enough, turn around." And the guard was training his rifle on me. So my dad was making sure that I didn't take off running away from one of these classified defense bases. So we were clearly involved in the military intelligence field, in protecting the country from the threats that we might see. I didn't perceive that my father and the other people in the program were really that hawkish. A lot of them were Nixon Republicans, but I think they were possibly trying to find ways to prevent warfare, because most of them had seen combat in World War II and been horrified by it. My dad was a combat medic and ambulance driver in France and Germany during the war, and was clearly not predisposed to view war as anything but the nightmare that it is. So I think that you could say that this group of Americans was hoping that if it perfected things like teleportation, it could prevent the next war, or even prevent nuclear war, in the sense that we could move people around very quickly. The chronovisors would allow us to gather information about threats that might come our way and cause us to not overact and start a nuclear war. I also had the opportunity to meet as a child some of the distinguished American scientists of the latter half, I would say, of the 20th century. Individuals like Dr. Agnew, who was present during all three critical stages of the Manhattan Project. Dr. Edward Teller, I met one afternoon when he was repairing one of the chronovisors in New Mexico, swearing up a storm. He was so frustrated trying to make it work, and he couldn't. My father introduced himself to Dr. Emilio Segre, another one of the Manhattan Project scientists, in the hallway at Lanel. And I remember he said, "Oh, teleportation, that's fascinating. You must keep me apprised of your activities." Dr. William Shockley, one of the co-inventors of the transistor at Bell Labs, was the only project participant to thank the children for our involvement. I met him at Bell Labs in mid-1972. And then, of course, Dr. Colgate, who would go on to a distinguished career at Lanel, a public career in astrophysics. And I think that was positive. I remember, I think just personally, a positive dimension of what I experienced is that I remembered everything that happened, so that moving forward in time, I could fulfill my life's purpose and tell the epic story of what Project Pegasus achieved. And then, of course, the trip to Gettysburg was also an extreme privilege to take part in. But to be true to everything that happened, how are we looking for time? 2 minutes? Oh my. Well, basically, I've run out of time, but to be true to what happened, we were basically subjected to mind control by the project. And in this talk, I was going to describe the different things that were done, basically to cause us to adhere to the secrecy regime and to not, to basically cooperate in project activities. So essentially, we were involved in things like state learning, where they would hypnotize us in the morning and then drug us in the afternoon after training us. They were inducing fear and intimidation. I was involved in this one game they set up at a local military arsenal, where when a light and a siren came on at one of the other children's desks, we had to push a button to shock the child, or we would be shocked. And it was explained that this is the kind of attitude you have to have when you work for the military, or you might have to kill or be killed, for example. Sick, yeah. We were basically subjected to things that would violate the torture convention. They tried to induce a split personality. We selected an alternate name. I selected the name Michael. And it certainly didn't work for me because I was Andy throughout the whole set of experiences. They were giving us some kind of drug. I think it may have been scopolamine, because scopolamine creates a form of temporary amnesia 8 hours before and after administration. So that allowed us to wake up the next morning not immediately remembering what we had done in the learning lab or involved in time travel the day before. Well, can I, let me finish. So can I have about 5 extra minutes just to finish out? Can we do that? Okay, thanks. So when I realized the degree to which they were engaged in these stratagems to make us cooperate, to make us not talk, and to make us forget, which was an odd thing to do when they were training us for time travel, I focused on 3 things that happened that for me revealed the utter cosmic injustice of treating us in this way. The first was that when they were training us on the chronovisor at Morristown, we were told not to look up at the light because one of the girls in the program had done so, and because of the brightness of the crystal array which generated the hologram, had been rendered permanently blind. So one of those 140 school kids was rendered blind. I personally witnessed another accident in which a boy teleported to Santa Fe. We were coming in groups, and he arrived standing in about 3 inches of water in a public fountain. And as my father later explained, because of the specific gravity of the water, he slid off his feet at the ankles. And when I ran past this location to get to the collection area after teleporting from another location, the one at Curtis Wright, I saw him on the ground writhing in pain, screaming, my feet, I'm only 9 years old. What am I going to do without any feet? And that was difficult to forget, even when they tried. And then there was a mishap of quantum displacement that I was involved in when we jumped in 1971, hoping to arrive in Santa Fe in 1971. But we learned to our consternation that it was 1991, and we had to summon Sandia and get home. And that trip from 1991 to 1971 was like basically a horrifying bad drug trip. It was a nightmarish experience. So I thought, here one girl's being rendered blind, another boy's lost his feet. We're sometimes being subjected to these brutal forces just in the time travel. How the hell can they be oppressing us like this? Because by the fall of 1970, about 2 years before the program ended, when we would jump back to Curtis Wright and pop into view there on the tarmac, they would take us inside the engineering building, sit us in seats, stick a plastic tongue depressor in our mouth, put a metal halo over our heads, and give us about 30 seconds of vigorous electrical shock. And that's done, of course, in mind control to dump endorphins and short-circuit the linkage between short and intermediate memory, because if you can't do that, you can't develop long-term memories about what you've just experienced. But I actually, although this is really the first time publicly that I've addressed the fact that they did use mind control on us, I've never really emphasized it because it didn't work on me. I'm often asked, well, how was it that you were literally in the hands of these Cold War Defense Department scientists, physicians, physicists, etc., and they weren't able to mind control you? And my answer has always been pretty simple. Basically, soul force. Soul force compelled me to resist the mind control that was being used to try to wrest from me the dignity and the sanctity of the memory of my own experience. The answer to mind control, as with any cosmic injustice, is soul force. Scripture tells us that greater is in us than is in the world. So it was in my response to the abuse that I experienced in Project Pegasus. Ultimately, I think that my story is a very positive one now that even as I reveal this mind control element. Soul force won. The truth won. Humanity won. One solitary human being motivated by the dream of bringing the benefits of teleportation to the entire world has defeated the entire U.S. Defense Department in its efforts to conceal time travel from the American people. Thank you.